Welcome back to C# for Total Noobs on Developer Ramp-Up. In this lesson we'll build on what we've learned so far and we will do some exercises with loops in C#. As said also in the previous video, loops are really a fundamental building block of computer programming. There is almost no program out there that doesn't use any loop. So it's very important for us to get familiar with it, to write code using loops, to really write down the syntax so that we really get acquainted with how to use them and when to use different types of loops instead of other types of loops. So let's get started with the first exercise and see exactly what requirement we have. So we have to write a program in C# that would display all natural numbers till and including n, and of course calculate their sum. This would mean that if a user should input something at the console like the number 5, what we need to do, or what our program needs to do, is to display all the numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 and calculate and display the sum of 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5. So this is exactly what we're gonna build right now in C#, so let's switch back to Visual Studio. Here we are back in our My First App solution and project in Visual Studio 2017, and we are really at the point where we left off last time. Let's go ahead and delete here a lot of things because we want to start everything from scratch. We'll keep this console write line and the information please enter an integer that is greater than 0. However, here I would like to make a slight change. As we have seen previously, or we can do this once again by debugging, so if we run this, what we notice is that the message that we want to have displayed is displayed on one line, but then the input of the number will take place on another line. To make this more intuitive, I would like to have everything displayed on the same line, so that when the user inputs the number, it should be displayed on the same line as the message that we display. So in order to do that, we would simply not use console write line but console write instead. And in this case, if you run the program right now, we should be able to see that if we input a number right now, this input is really on the same line where we also display the message. So this is one important thing to know, that you could also use console write, and this would display basically all the contents on the same line. If we write console write line, it will then display the string that we want to display, but afterwards it would also insert a new line. Now the next step, of course, is to let's say take that number, because the user inputs a number from the keyboard, but we have to take it and to assign it to a variable. So we would use int number equal and then int parse and console readline. This is not anything new. We have done this also when we've gone through the exercises on if statements. So right now, after this point, we should have this number. Of course, what we have to implement right now is the for loop. So it would be for and parentheses, and let's also add the curly braces for the code block, and here let's define the for loop. So it would be int I, but right now what we want is to start always from 1. Then I should be less than or equal to number, because what we want to do is to include that number. It was written like that in the requirement, and then we have to increase the counter. So this is the basic syntax of the for loop. Now we can go ahead and think about the logic that we want to implement. In the previous lesson, when we've done exercises on for loops, we have seen that just to simply display the numbers, we could use console.writeLine and then I, and this would display the number. However, once again, what I would like to do is to display all the numbers on the same line. So I will do then a console write. Let's first run this program to see how our progress is so far. We have to input a number. Let's take 4, and then we see that 1, 2, 3 and 4 are all on the same line. However, right now we have a problem, because we want to make this visually to look better for the user. Right now, if we input the number, we can just see a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 without any space. So this is something that we could also interpret as a number. as 12,345. And this is here really not the case. So what we would have to add here is some logic so that each number is displayed on the same line, but then we have also a comma and space after each number. So an easy way to do this would simply be to add something to this I, which would be a string, and let's add a comma and a space. And right now, if we run the program again, what it would happen is that if we input the number, we have 1, 2, and 3. However, right now the problem is then that for the last number, which in this case is 3, we really don't want to display the comma and the space, because it really doesn't make any sense, since we do not have anything that comes after the last number. So in this case, we could do some more logic, and we could also use an if statement, so that we do not forget how to use the if statements. What we basically want to achieve right now is to make or to decide upon a certain condition, and if that condition is true, we should display this I plus and comma and space, but if that condition is not true, it should simply display I. So what we can do is display a condition, and in this condition let's also add the curly braces for the code block. Let's think about it. How could we achieve it? So we know that the last number is also I, and we know that from the condition that we have in the for loop, that the last I would be equal to number. So what we could do is we could use this equality operator, and when I is number, so only in this case we would console.write, and here we write only I, because we really don't need anything else. And then we could use an else, which is for all other cases. We could use this I and also with a comma and a space. So let's just simply copy and paste this console write. We should normally avoid copy pasting code. This is not a good idea. And right now let's run this program once again and check exactly what happens. So let's input 5, and in this case we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is all correct. So the first part of the requirement is already done. We have a for loop that displays all the numbers from 1 to the number that the user gives us as input in the console. Now we have to think about the second part. And the second part of this exercise was that we simply should calculate the sum of all these numbers. So one way to easily do that is to use another variable, and let's declare it here, int sum, and let's make it 0, because if we know that if we add something to 0, the new result would be the number that we've added. So this would not influence at all the way that our sum is calculated. What we, however, need to do is simply to calculate the sum. But where to do that? In this for loop, of course, we could calculate the sum. But where exactly? Because if we put it here in this if statement, it would only calculate the sum for all numbers except the last one. If you calculate the sum in the else code block, what it would happen, it would only calculate the sum for all the other numbers, but not the last one. So of course that we need to calculate the sum outside of this if else logic. So in this case would simply be sum equals sum plus I, because I is the current number that we have displayed and that we also have to add to the previously calculated sum. So this is the more verbose way of writing it, but we could also write it in a more fancy way, and this would be sum plus equals I. And this would do exactly the same thing as if we would have written sum equals sum plus I. So it's exactly the same thing, only that in this case we need just to write fewer code. If you want now, just take a break, pause this video, write all this code by yourself and try to understand how it should work. Then afterwards you should you can go ahead with this video, and right now what we want to do is simply run the program. But of course, before running the program, we also have to display the sum. So what we would have to do is console dot write line. This time we want to have it on a new line, and here we would need to say the sum of all numbers is, and we would have to use the sum. So one way that we can do this is using string interpolation, and we used this method several times also in the previous exercises. What this string interpolation means, it means basically that we have to type this $sign before the string, and this means that each time we will put something into curly braces in this string, .NET will know that here we should look for the variable value and not take this literal. So in this case we could simply do sum. Okay, so right now we would good to go. Let's run this program. Let's provide a number. The first number that we provide is 5, and we have 1, 2, 3, 5, and the sum of all number is 15. The only issue that we see here is that the sum comes immediately after this last 5. So let's fix this also. What we can do is that we know where we have the logic for our last number, and the logic is here. So instead of writing a comma and a space, what we could do here is just add a new line. And we have also seen this in other exercises. How we can do this is simply providing I plus, which means that we want to add something. So we add a new string, but in the new string we just place the new line escape sequence. So this \n will instruct the console to jump to the next line. So purely theoretically, after the last number is displayed, we should have a new line. So the text that comes afterwards should be displayed correctly under the displayed numbers. Let's run this program once again. In this case, let's input 6, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the sum of all numbers is 21. Let's try to let's try this with a bigger number. Let's take 24, and we have here all the numbers displayed, and their sum is 300. So this means that our program right now is completed. So we have implemented all the requirements that we have seen previously. We display this message, the user needs to input a number, then we will display all the numbers from 1 till the number that the user provided, and afterwards we just also displayed the sum of all numbers. So this program is right now completed. You can save it if you want somewhere, so that you can take a look at this program at a later time. Now let's get back to the second exercise that we want to go through, and we should look at the requirements first. This time we will have to write a C# program to read 10 numbers from the keyboard and find their sum and average. There is a little twist compared to what we have done so far, because so far we have asked the user to input a number, and then we have displayed all the numbers until that number. In this case, what we want to do is, however, make the user input 10 different numbers by itself. So what we would have to do is then to read all these numbers and then display their sum and average. Let's see how we can implement that in C#. Let's now delete everything that we have written for the previous exercise and start from scratch. What we would have to do is first have a console write line here, because we want this to be on a separate line, and here the user would need to enter 10 numbers. Please enter 10 numbers. Okay, now everything is set up, we can start. How should we, however, go through this? Because what we need to do is to make the user input 10 times something from the console, and then we can take these numbers, add them, and calculate the average. So we could do this one where I would say easy way, but it's not at all a way that a software developer would use. Something like having now 10 different variables, holding each time the number that the user inputs, and at the end we can simply calculate the sum and the average of all 10 variables. However, this is really not the way to do it. The best way to do it is using, of course, a for loop. So what you would need is a for loop, and here we could specify int y equals 1 because we want to start at the first number. Then this should be less than 10. We know that the user needs to input 10 numbers, so we should make then this less than or equal to 10 to make sure that these are really 10 numbers, and then to increase the counter. Now the very cool thing here that in this for loop what we can do is simply declare an int number equals and int dot parse console read line. Okay, read line. So what this would mean, it would mean that we will go through a loop, and each time that we are in the loop, so when this code block gets executed, we get the number that the user gives us in the console. And of course, what we can do afterwards, we can simply add these numbers and then calculate their average. However, there is something else that we could do here and also use a console.write. Console.write, and in this console.write we would simply say, let's change some language settings that I have here, and here we could simply number, and this is, let's say, the first number that the user enters and so on. Here would also have to use this string interpolation, and here number I, and that's it. So now the user would exactly know which number does he input right now, the first, the second, the third, and so on. And then we do this int number and then int parse console read line. Now the next thing that we need to do here is to add two variables, because we need to calculate sum and average. So we go int sum equals 0, okay, and double because we want to have an average, so it could also have numbers that are smaller than 1 unit, so double dot average, and this would be equal also 0 for right now. Good, so we have now these two variables, now we can use them. Thinking logically about this, what we could do in this for loop is we could add always something to the sum. So what we would do is simply sum plus equals number. What this would mean is that, well, we could also write it like sum equals sum plus number, as we already said in the previous videos. So we declare the sum here and initialize it to 0, but each time we go through the loop and recalculate the sum, the value that we recalculated would be basically the value of the sum itself. So the next time we go through the loop, the sum will not be 0, but it will be 1 or 2 or whatever we calculated previously. And it goes like this until we basically exit the loop and this code does not get executed at all. At that time we would know that we have the final sum. Where do we calculate the average? Well, while the sum is something that we can calculate, let's say on the fly while we are in this code block, in order to calculate the average we need to know that all numbers are already there, or that we have the final sum, including also the last number. So this is why we would calculate the sum outside of this for loop. Sorry, we will calculate the average outside this for loop. And average would be equal and sum divided by 10. And since we declared the average variable as double, we divide it by 10.0. Because otherwise it would simply divide it as an integer. In this case we would force that this result, this average result, will also have value after the dot, if it is the case, of course. And right now we could go on and console write things, or console write line things. Console write line here it's a semicolon, and we would also use string interpolation here. The sum of your provided numbers is, and let's go one step back. Here that would be, still it's not correct, it would be sum, and then we also have to console.writeLine, and here what we need to do is display the average. The average of your provided numbers is, and here we display average, it's AVG. So this should do it. Let's run this program and check exactly if this works. So we run it, and we will see exactly if it works as expected. If not, maybe we would have to do some more tweaks to this program so that it's conformant to the requirements. So what we see here is please enter 10 numbers. Let's go 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6, then 7, then 8, then 9, and finally 10. And we see the sum of your provided numbers is 55, and the average of your provided numbers is 5.5, which is correct. So what this basically means is that our exercise is correct. What we have done here is we've created a program that is fully compliant to the requirements that we've read earlier. So we make the user input 10 numbers from the keyboard, we calculate the sum of their numbers, and we also calculate the average. Since we know that the user would display 10 numbers, it's of course then when we calculate the average, we can use 10, because we know it won't be 11 or 9 or 8 or whatever, or whatever the user might think to input as a number. So we always know that we have 10 numbers. So this is why it's easy to calculate the average this way. So that's for the second exercise. Let's go now to the third exercise and see exactly what the requirements are. With this one, it gets a little bit trickier. What we would need to do is write a program in C# to display a pattern like a right angle triangle using an asterisk. And here on the right side you see exactly what we mean. So the user needs to input a certain number, and based on that number we should calculate, or we should display this pattern using asterisk. In this case, in this example that we see right now on screen, the user has 4 as input. So this means that we have to go 4 times and write something to the console. So the first time we write only 1 star or 1 asterisk, then 2 asterisks, then 3, and then 4. The idea is that the same pattern, or let's say the same pattern is displayed no matter what the provided number is. So if the user provides us 100, then we should display this pattern containing more or less 100 lines. And if the user inputs as number 50, we should display this pattern but on 50 lines, and so on. Let's then get back to Visual Studio and see exactly how we can implement this, because this is a little bit trickier. Let's delete everything that we have here except this console read line. The idea is that for this exercise we really do not need any user input, we just have to display this type of pattern. Of course, at a later point, if you just want to improve this program, we can make the user input a certain number like 4, 5, 6 and so on, and based on that number we should then calculate and display that pattern. But if I think better, let's do this right away. So let's assume that the user would need to input a certain number which is greater than 0, and then based on the number that the user inputs we would display the pattern. So let's start with the console.writeLine, and here we want to display the information. Please enter a number greater than 0 and we'll display a pattern. So that's it. Right now what we need is to take the input from the user, so int number equals int.parse, and here we should write this console readline because we want to parse what the user gives us in the console, and we're basically set up. So right now we have to logically think about how this is done. Well, it might not be that intuitive, but I would say straightforward that in order to solve this type of problem, we need two loops. And every time that you have exercises similar to this, when you have to display a certain pattern, you usually have to use at least two loops, which are nested. So let's get started and use a first loop. And in this first loop, what we would do is we will declare I as our variable, and we should start at 1 once again because we are not working with an array or list, and we should have as condition when I is less than number, or let's make it less than or equal to number to have that number included, and then we have to increase the counter. Then what we would need here in this loop is a second loop. And in this loop we will do some slight changes because we cannot use also I since I was used previously. And we are in the same code block, so this variable is already defined here. We cannot also define it once again because it is in the same scope as we talked about, I think, in the second lesson of this C# for Total Noobs course. So what we would have to do is, then is use another variable name, which is J in this case. Once again, you could anything else, A, B, Z, V, any letter or any variable name that you would like to use, you can use it here. Here we have to specify another condition. And the idea is that we need to specify here J is less than or equal to Y. And while this is true, what we will do is simply console.write. And what we need to write to the console, it's basically only an asterisk, so a normal string, and we would do it like that. So this is accomplished. This would then write on the same line an asterisk or several asterisks depending on if J is less than or equal to I. And also let's make J start with 1. Now the next thing is when we finish this inner for loop, we have two loops. We can call the first loop where we use I as an outer loop and the second loop as an inner loop. So after we really finish the inner loop, so this condition is not true anymore, what we want to do is display everything on a line and make sure that everything that comes afterwards will be displayed on the next line. And this should basically do it. Let's run the program and see if this is really the case. And I will provide as first value, let's provide a 5. And what it happens, it has displayed the pattern, which is correct. Let's now just do a small tweak here. We want to have here console write on the same line, and the user would input a number. So that would basically do it. Let's run this program once again, and let's input a number, and it displays this pattern. Let's input a greater number to see exactly if this pattern keeps up the same way. So let's put 10, and indeed we have 10. And right now, once again, let's put a slightly larger number. Let's put 24. So you see that it's no matter what number we provide at the keyboard, the pattern remains basically the same. Now, what I want to still do in this exercise, because this is maybe a little bit more difficult to grasp, I would like to place a breakpoint here just when we enter this for loop. And what I would like to do is take a look and see exactly how this works. So we run this program. Of course, first we have to input a certain number. Let's make it not a very large number. Let's make it 3 for this exercise. And right now we have hit our breakpoint because the execution of this program entered this for loop. Let's evaluate what we have here. So first we have I, which equals 1. Then we have number, which is 3, and we evaluate if 1 is less than or equal to 3. of course that this is true. So what this means is that we begin to execute the code in this outer for loop. But when we start to execute this code in the outer for loop, guess what? We start right away with another loop. So it works exactly the same way. We initialize a variable, this time it is called j, and we set it to 1. We evaluate if j is less than or equal to y, and in this case j is 1, I is 1, so it is equal, which is correct. So what it would do in this case, it would simply go and execute the code block in this inner loop. And this will print this asterisk to the console. Then, as we know from the loops, we increase j. So we do not go further until we exited this for loop, this inner for loop. So we have to be ready with it to execute this next line of code. And right now, if we increase j will become now 2. If we hover the mouse, we see 2. When we evaluate the condition, we see that of course 2 is not less than or equal to 1. So what it would happen is that this code block is not executed anymore because the condition was not met. So we simply exit the loop, and the execution continues by executing the code that comes after this inner for loop. And here we just have a console write line which will print or will go to a next line. What will happen then is that we have finished all the code in this outer loop, and of course as a next step we increase the counter. So I will now become 2. So is 2 less than or equal to the number 3? And this is of course true. So what it happens here is that we execute of course everything that it is in this outer for loop. But once again in this outer for loop we hit the inner loop and we start from scratch. We declare j equals 1, we evaluate if j is less than or equal to I is in this case 2. So of course that this condition is right now true, so we execute the code block and we write an asterisk. Remember, we are now on the second line. Now of course we increase the counter, j will become 2. The condition that j is less than or equal to I is still true because I is also true. So what we will do here in this case, we will once again execute what we have here. So we will write a second asterisk on that line and we will increase the counter. The counter will now be 3, I will be 2. So this condition is right now false. So we basically say, okay, we've done, go to the next line. And then we hit once again the outer loop where we increase I. And this time after we increase it, I would be equal to 3. And the number is also equal to 3. This means that the condition is still true. So we execute everything that it is in that code block. Once again, we start over with the second for loop with the inner loop. And in this case, we have j equals 1, j is less than or equal to 3, which is correct. So we write this asterisk. Then we increase j, which will be 2. Is 2 less than or equal to 3? Of course it is, so we will write one more asterisk. Then we will increase the counter. Only the counter in this j loop, of course, in this inner for loop. And we still evaluate the condition. This should still be true because j should be right now 3 and the number should be 3, so this is okay. So one more time we execute everything what we have here, and then we increase the counter. The condition is now false, of course, so we don't execute this code block anymore and we just add a new line. Then we go back to the outer loop and the counter increases once again. However, right now I should be 4 and number should be 3. So in this case the condition will be false. So we will simply exit the loop and execute the next line of code that we have afterwards, which is this console read line. And by the time we execute this, we look at the console, we have this pattern with asterisks and the number we displayed, it was 3. So this pattern is not that large this time. However, I strongly encourage you to play around with this type of loop, to place a breakpoint and to see exactly what happens at each pass through the loop, because this concept of using two nested loops is really very important. All basic sorting algorithms work basically with a nested for loop, and this is why this type of nesting of for loops is really important to understand and grasp. In the next lesson we will talk about classes. So this lesson or this course will become really interesting, because we will hit one of the core fundamentals or core concepts of object-oriented programming, which is classes. And we'll see exactly what a class is, what a class can contain, and we'll see exactly how we can use our own classes here in our console application. Thank you very much for watching this, and I hope to see you in the next lesson.